Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, the cause of the fire, as you've already heard, is not yet known. Kensington and Chelsea Council says it will be fully investigated and that the tower block was regularly inspected. Some residents say they had been warning about the risk of fire at that tower block, though. Our Home Affairs correspondent Tom Simons reports on what the investigation into Grenfell Tower will be looking at.
A death trap. That is what some residents believe Grenfell Tower was. Their high-rise home in ashes, friends and relatives dead, injured or fighting for their lives. They say, we told you something was going to happen, again and again. And the proof of that was not hard to find. This is a blog by the Tower's Residents Association, which says, it is a truly terrifying thought, but the Grenfell Action Group firmly believes that only a catastrophic event will expose the ineptitude and incompetence of our landlord, the KCTMO, the Kensington and Chelsea Tenant Management Organisation, and bring an end to the dangerous living conditions and neglect of health and safety legislation that they inflict upon their tenants and leaseholders. It was posted last November.
We repeatedly reported concerns to the tenant management organisation of the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, including fire safety concerns, which were not investigated during the regeneration works.
The tower is owned by the council. Its running was handed to the tenant management organisation in the 1990s. The complaints followed. They included concerns about this advice to residents to stay put inside a flat if there was a fire outside. There were also reports of faulty safety equipment, power surges and inadequate fire alarms. And it wasn't just the Grenfell. This is the Adair Tower. It has the same management. There was a fire here too in 2015, arson. Luckily, there was no loss of life. Following what happened here, the management was issued with an enforcement order by the fire brigade. It set out a string of failings to ensure preventative measures to properly assess the risk, failure to offer a well-marked escape route, and to have an emergency plan. People were angry then, now they're furious. Jose has lived here for 30 years. He has friends fighting for their lives after the Grenfell fire, just a mile away.
In this tower, we've had a fire. Trellick Tower had a fire. It's just happening too often.
3 towers, 3 fires?
Yeah, within a year.
And in your tower here, what changes were made following the fire in 2015?
Basically, they put signs up, which we didn't have. They changed the doors, the fire doors, which they weren't. And basically that's it.
So, do you think that's enough?
No, it's not.
He's got a smoke alarm in his flat now, but he's still worried there's no central fire alarm, a concern also raised at the Grenfell fire. Council documents reveal there was a review of fire safety last year. The Grenfell was last given a comprehensive fire risk assessment 18 months ago during its refurbishment when it was covered with new cladding, a common process. So the government's ordered wider checks tonight.
We've discussed with the Department for Communities and Local Government, local authorities and the fire service a process whereby we seek to identify towers that might be in a similar process of refurbishment, run a system of checks and inspections so that we as quickly as possible can give reassurance to people.
The investigation will begin once the exhausting task of putting out the inferno at the Grenfell Tower is complete. Getting to the bottom of why it spread so fast could take months. Tom Simons, BBC News, West London.
Well, millions of people around the world live in skyscrapers. The key question, of course, is how to keep those who live in them safe. As we've heard, Grenfell Tower was completely refurbished just last year, and some fire safety experts have already pointed to the cladding on the building as a likely reason that the blaze spread so quickly. Our science editor David Shookman looks at the safety of tower blocks and asks to what extent they can be made safe.
The wreckage of Grenfell House stands amid a cluster of tower blocks. Like many cities around the world, London has seen the rise of the skyscraper. Homes and offices perched high above street level with a host of safety rules designed to resist fire. But 8 years ago, a blaze at this tower block in South London killed 6 people. Southwark Council was fined for breaching fire regulations. And there are plenty of expert voices today saying that the lessons of what happened here at Lakanal House have not been learned.
Lakanal House demonstrated people were at risk in their own homes. The fire in West London last night, this morning, has demonstrated that they are still at risk in their own homes. These fires shouldn't be happening in 21st century London. We've got the ability to stop them from happening, and when fires do break out, to restrict them to small areas of flats or buildings.
One key question in the spotlight today is about the design of tower blocks and how they're meant to keep people safe in case a fire breaks out. Now, normally a fire hose can only reach about 15 metres. Grenfell Tower stands 67 metres high. In America, they rely on what's called active safety. Sprinklers fight fires in every room, but that can be expensive. The basic principle here, until recently, has been passive safety, designing the building to confine any blaze to a single room. Clearly that's failed. Investigators will want to know why. Another focus will be on the cladding fitted to the outside of the building, panels to improve insulation and the look of older buildings like Grenfell Tower. But dozens of fires have been linked to cladding around the world. 2 years ago, a skyscraper in Dubai caught fire and the cladding was blamed. New rules there have tightened up on the kind of materials that can be used. And investigators here will explore what role the cladding might have played.
In the UK, it has to be of what we call of limited combustibility, and I'm sure that's going to be questioned now after this fire, what exactly that means and on what these types of cladding systems are adding to the fire load on the building.
It was after the Second World War that councils answered the housing crisis by moving away from old terraced homes into new high-rise tower blocks. But their safety from fire depends on good design and careful maintenance. The London Mayor says people living in tower blocks will now need to be reassured. And fire professionals are shocked by how this blaze spread.
Literally every single floor was on fire internally. We don't usually see that. You see 1 floor, 2 floors, and then a hopping from floor to floor maybe over a period of time, but you would not normally see an entire facade on fire and then all the interior on fire at the same time. So that's what's very unusual.
So the fire overcame whatever safety features were in place. Last year, the government promised a review into fire safety in tower blocks, but then delayed it. This disaster now makes that work a priority. David Shukman, BBC News.
Well, the blaze here overnight has meant that much of business in Westminster has been put on hold, including an announcement that was expected to confirm that the Democratic Unionists have agreed a deal to support the Conservatives in government. In a statement this morning, Theresa May said she was deeply saddened by the loss of life in the tower block fire. And Jeremy Corbyn had this to say a little earlier.
Totally shocked by it. It's the worst nightmare anyone can think of. A fire in a tower block, and sympathy, support and solidarity to all those that are stuck in the tower or have managed to be rescued or who've lost loved ones or don't know what has happened to their friends and family. And a huge thank you to the fire service, police and ambulance and all the other emergency services that got there so quickly.
Well, let's speak to our political correspondent, Alex Forsyth, who is in Westminster. It has, as I say, put a lot of Westminster business on hold. Tell us more about the reaction today.
Well, Sophie, as you heard there, politicians are again finding themselves paying tribute to the emergency services in the wake of a tragic incident. You heard it from the Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn. This morning, in a statement, the Prime Minister, Theresa May, said her thoughts were with those working tirelessly in very difficult circumstances. She said she was deeply saddened by the loss of life. She has been, throughout the day, as you would expect, been briefed on developments. And there was a cross-government meeting this afternoon to coordinate the government's response and to make sure the emergency services are getting the support they need. The Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, has already suggested there will be questions about whether enough preventative measures were taken in the past. There is even talk of a public inquiry. Tonight, the Policing and Fire Minister, Nick Hurd, said there would have to be a process to understand what had happened. But initially, it's about dealing with the emergency response. I think we will hear more about those questions in coming days. But for now, the focus from politicians is about getting the support to those who've been affected.
A little earlier, I spoke to the newly elected MP for Kensington, Emma Dent-Coad. She's also a member of the London Fire Authority and knows something about architecture. Are the authorities, particularly the borough authorities, pulling hard enough to provide for these people?
Well, the coordination has been pretty appalling, frankly, with all this help and love coming forward, all these people coming out to help each other. It's been absolutely extraordinary, but there's very little coordination. I can't do that. Surely it's the borough's job to do that. I know people are being housed, but coordinating what's going on here.
How are they being housed? Because there's a lot of them.
Well, they're going into hotels. The council are block booking hotels.
Yeah.
They say so far that everybody who's come forward for housing has a bed tonight. That's number one. Bed, food, and somewhere they can unwind and rest of it. People are traumatised.
Is incredible.
Yeah, well, this is what we are. This is what we are. This is our community. This is why they voted me in. This is Kensington, not the Kensington that people imagine.
Yeah, but the Kensington that people imagine is the borough in charge. And
well, that's what I'm wondering, yeah.
That may be where one wonders where the buck stops.
Well, the buck stops, well, as far as this kind of organisation is concerned, it should be the council.
Yeah.
As far as that is concerned, it's the TMO who run the council housing. The buck should stop with them.
But ultimately, the public authority somewhere has some responsibility.
Well, they own all the property, yes, they do, yeah, exactly.
Are you satisfied? I know it's very early to say, but, I mean, will we get to the bottom of this?
I'll make sure we do. I won't rest until we do. We can never, ever have anything like this again. We've had fires. We've had 3 fires in my ward that I'm responsible for, Goulburn Ward. We have 3 tower blocks. They've all had fires in the past few years.
But they weren't refurbished in the way this one was.
No, they weren't.
And, I mean, we were here early enough to see the cladding absolutely going off like a bomb. I mean, do you get any real sense of the fatalities?
Well, there are 6 confirmed so far. There are some people in hospital who are critical, and they're working through. They're getting a drone in. They can't go into some parts of the building yet. They're getting a drone in to go through all the floors just to see. I don't see how anybody could still be alive in there. So, either people, if there are people missing, they may be somewhere else. They may be in hospital and can't identify themselves. They may have gone to somebody and be in a traumatized state, or sadly, I have a horrible feeling there may be more fatalities, and that's awful for their loved ones.
And your constituents can depend upon you to ensure that there is an independent inquiry.
Absolutely.
Truly independent.
Absolutely. Absolutely. No mistake about that at all.
The newly elected Labour MP Emma Dent-Coad talking to me earlier, and her fears were confirmed after our interview when the police announced that the death toll had doubled to 12. In a statement earlier, Kensington & Chelsea Tenant Management Organisation, which manages the building, said it is too early to speculate what caused the fire and contributed to its spread. We are aware that concerns have been raised historically by residents. We always take all concerns seriously, and these will form part of our forthcoming investigations. While these investigations continue with our cooperation, our core priority at the moment is our residents. Well, a little earlier I also spoke to the leader of Kensington Chelsea Council, Nicholas Paget-Brown.
It is very clear that the fire spread fast, and there will need to be a proper inquiry into the materials used and the evacuation processes, and we will need to establish why this fire that started in one flat spread so very quickly to the whole building. Our hearts go out to everybody who's been affected by this, and the council is doing all that it can to identify alternative accommodation and to support people who very quickly had to leave their homes.
So just last year saw the completion of an £8.6 million refurbishment of Grenfell Tower. The work involved the installation of exterior cladding around the building and the provision of new windows. But could that very refurbishment have played a role in increasing the fire risk at the block? Tonight, the government said that checks would be carried out on blocks undergoing similar refurbishments. Did safety warnings go unheeded? Ed Hauker has this report.
Questions are rising out of Grenfell Tower and looming over London's social housing. Why didn't residents get out? Why were there no sprinklers? And another question, what about the building regulations that are meant to protect the families who can no longer live here? Residents wrote online about terrifying electrical surges, and fire safety experts say that without sprinklers, England's tower blocks are at risk. In total, there are 4,000 of them without active fire suppressant measures. The warning sign was Lakanal House in Camberwell. That claimed 6 victims almost a decade ago. And one expert I spoke to answered the phone this morning with the words, "It's happening again." Lakanal House, which burned in the summer of 2009, haunts London's housing specialists. They warned that worse could happen if the right lessons weren't learned about the fire risks of insulation and the need for sprinklers. Tony Bird is a housing consultant. He started his career letting flats at Grenfell House for Kensington Council.
The lessons of Lakanal House fire have not been learnt. And it took several years for that inquiry to come out and to establish things there. It would worry me if there's going to be an inquiry, obviously, about this. It's going to worry me that's going to take 7 years as well.
What's the significance of sprinkler systems for tower blocks like this?
Well, it could make the difference between the fire spreading if you have it in every flat. It's not required on refurbishments in this country, and the contractor is right to say that he's complying with the regulations, but that's because the regulations are weak. In Scotland and Wales they're stronger.
Built in the 1970s, Grenfell Tower was renovated last year at a cost of £8.7 million. This photo of the refurbishment shows parts of the building's original concrete. Aluminium frames are put directly on top, and foil-covered insulation panels are inserted. Metal rain screen cladding is then placed onto the frame. A gap is left between the rain screen and the insulation to prevent moisture getting in. Experts have suggested this airspace can act like a chimney, drawing air and fire up the building. Safety standards aim to prevent this chimney effect.
The government needs to regulate them much more stringently. They've been pressed for a number of years by the all-party parliamentary group on fire safety to review the building regulations that appertain to these materials there, and they still haven't done it.
Today, the company responsible for the refurbishment said,
"We are shocked to hear of the devastating fire at Grenfell Tower, and our immediate thoughts are with those that have been affected. Ryden completed a refurbishment of the building in the summer of 2016, which met all required building control, fire regulation and health and safety standards."
Crews of firemen are still working at the site. Policing and Fire Minister Nick Hurd said emergency checks will now be made on other tower blocks going through refurbishments, similar to Grenfell Tower. But the checks are one day too late for London.
With me is the Labour MP Jim Fitzpatrick, a member of the all-party parliamentary fire safety rescue group and previously a firefighter with the London Fire Brigade in Battersea for 23 years, and Ian Leher from the Fire Brigades Union. Ian, this has been an unbelievably taxing job for the firefighters there. I think there were, well, do you know how many there were deployed on it?
Well, as far as we've been told, 250 firefighters have attended this incident today. It's devastating.
And nothing like it in recent history?
No, the only thing I can think of in any comparison was Lakanal House in 2009. But again, it wasn't on the level of this. Firefighters have worked to exceeded their limitations. They're exhausted. They've done, I believe, the best they could possibly do.
Did they have all the kit they need to fight a fire in a tower block?
They would have come with as many resources as was available. I'm sure that any inquiry investigation after this will look at all of those factors to deliver answers for learning for future.
I mean, presumably one of the reasons why you don't have kind of tower block provision is because this just is not designed to happen. We're living in the 21st century.
Well, of course, the buildings are built, constructed so that they are compartments and they should be safe. We do inspect some, but we don't inspect all of them now because third parties are involved in fire safety, not just the London Fire Brigade.
Jim Fitzpatrick, that's the issue, is that we're talking about something in the 21st century which simply should not happen.
You're absolutely right, it shouldn't be happening. After the Lakanal House fire that Ian mentioned, where 6 people died, there was a coroner's inquiry, there were a raft of recommendations, some of which have been carried out, others which haven't. The big question that the all-party group has for government is a review of what they call Approved Document B, which are the building regulations which cover all buildings across the UK. Buildings are changing all the time. If this was being constructed today, it would have to have a sprinkler system. Because it was built in 1974, it didn't have a sprinkler system.
Well, shouldn't that be changed immediately? That unfortunately, when you refurbish a building, you have to put the sprinklers in. There weren't even any fire alarms.
Indeed.
Not one fire alarm went off other than a domestic one on the fifth floor.
The smoke detectors in individual residents' flats would have gone off, but there isn't a system which would alert the whole building.
Yes.
And
well,
of course,
why not?
Well, the Lacanau House inquiry made a whole raft of recommendations. As I say, a lot of them are still to be carried out. And putting sprinkler systems on buildings like this, nobody would have died in this building if it had been sprinkled.
And then there's the extraordinary fact, which we are certain is true, that there were these labels in the flats saying, in the event of a fire, stay in the flat.
Well, I think that it is policy for the London Fire Brigade to keep people in their compartments, and to be honest with you, the building construction is designed to ensure they're safe. They should be able to stay in there, and they shouldn't have to worry about a fire in another part of the building.
Quite clearly in this building.
And that's a question that needs to be looked at in the inquiry.
Indeed, and Ian's absolutely right. If the specification of the protection, the level of protection in terms of fire doors, in terms of the cladding, in terms of the integrity of the building, people should be safe in their flats for up to an hour for the fire brigade to arrive and then tell them what they have to do. In this instance, the spread was far too rapid.
I've been here since 8 o'clock this morning, and I saw the level to which the hoses could reach, and it was about the 11th floor. Isn't it possible to have anything? What about helicopters? Do you have helicopters?
I've heard this today.
No,
and
we're
we're
amateurs.
I think it's a rubbish one to come out with, because, quite frankly, if we had an helicopter anywhere near that building today, it would have fanned the fire and made it 10 times worse than it is now.
I see.
But yeah, you're right. There is issues. Was the dry riser charged? That will come out in the inquiry. And yeah, we do not have appliances that can go further than what that is now. But we are not in America. We don't have the big roads, and that is the biggest truck.
Do you know what the residents said to me, and we'll see it in my film later? They said, if this had happened in Chelsea, something would have happened to prevent this happening.
Well, questions have to be asked. The inquiry will have to look at the recommendations from Lacanau and ask why it's not been done. When buildings are being refurbished, that's the opportunity to put suppression system in to protect the residents in high-rises, and there are thousands of high-rises like this across the country, and people will be seeking assurances from the local fire brigade, their landlords, and from local authorities right across the country at the moment, because this shouldn't be happening in the 21st century.
Shall I tell you an assurance that people have told me they want, particularly poorer people, working class people in this area, and people who've emerged from those as survivors from those flats, that we won't be turfed out of here when they rebuild this place and be replaced by rich people with big flats.
And that's an
Can you give them that undertaking?
That's an entirely reasonable demand, and I hope Kensington and Chelsea Council give the assurance to the local residents that they will be rehoused in whatever replaces this tower block, which obviously is going to have to come down.
Thank you, Jim Fitzpatrick. Ian Lehan, thank you very much indeed. Joe, you were in one of the lower buildings that's attached to this.
Yes, that's right.
What happened to you?
Basically, a neighbour of mine knocked me at about roughly 5 or 10 past 1. He told me that there was a fire outside. I ran out with him. There were people there already who were sort of trying to throw things up at windows to get people's
Smash
attention.
The glass, yeah.
Well, no, it was more just to make noise on the windows because the intercom system at the bottom you couldn't go near because the plastic cladding was raining down on the ground at the time. So all people were doing was throwing things up and making noise and trying to shout and get people up. But frankly, I don't know, like I don't even think we should have done it, to be honest, John, because what did we wake them for? You know, they just basically, they woke up and they were still trapped in that building and no one could get out.
So desperate were some that they jumped?
Some people jumped, yeah. I saw people jump. I know a lady who threw her kid out, but I didn't witness that myself. But I did see 2 people jump when I was at the back of the block, roughly an hour or so after it started.
This is shocking stuff. I mean, how are you now? I mean, that's a horrible thing to live through.
It's, you just get on with it at the time, really. I mean, all I did at the time was I tried to get people to make noise, then I went back inside, I knocked all of my neighbours' doors, I made as much noise as I could in there. I grabbed my neighbour and her 3.5-year-old kid upstairs, I came downstairs, I grabbed my dogs and I got the hell out.
Now, what about you? Because you, although you live in this area, I mean, you weren't actually over there, but you do rap about the inner city.
Yeah.
Does this confirm a lot of what you've been rapping about?
Absolutely. The people who died and lost their homes, this happened to them because they are poor. We are in one of the richest spaces, not just in London, but in the world. Repeated requests were ignored. There is no way that rich people live in a building without adequate fire safety. Everyone I spoke to who was out there couldn't hear alarms. There was no sprinkler system.
There was no alarms.
But what's so curious is that £8 million has been spent refurbishing.
Yeah, because it was an eyesore for the rich people that live opposite.
There were
so they
no
put panels, pretty panels on the outside, so the rich people opposite wouldn't have to look at a horrendous block.
If I didn't have this fob, people wouldn't have been able to get out the back of the block. They would have been forced to run out to underneath the tower block.
That fob opened the door?
Yes, because it opened the centre doors, because those ones, are, each half of the block is sealed from the other half. But I have this fob which goes all the way through. In the end, I opened the doors, I grabbed people's doormats and I threw them there to keep the doors wedged open.
Tonight's main news then, 12 people have been confirmed as having been killed in a fire in a West London tower block, this one behind me. But police say that the number is likely to increase. The fire in the Grenfell Tower in Kensington rapidly became a raging inferno. The block was refurbished with external cladding only last year, and tests are to be carried out on similarly refurbished blocks.
The Tower is one of a number of blocks of flats in this part of West London. It is a typical high-rise building designed in the 1960s and built in the 1970s. The tower block is made of concrete and has 120 flats and around 400 to 600 residents. It has 24 stories, but only 20 are residential. Council plans show each floor has only one stairway out and 2 lifts. It doesn't have a sprinkler system, and escaping residents say there was no central fire alarm. Last year, an £8.6 million refurbishment was completed. That was when the contractors fitted new cladding, windows and a heating system. Well, both before and after that refurbishment, a residents' action group had warned about fire safety. Last November, they wrote with a terrible ring of prophecy, "We firmly believe that only a catastrophic event will expose the ineptitude and incompetence of our landlord and bring to an end the dangerous living conditions." As Chris Choi reports now, if there was anger about safety standards before the fire, there is fury now.
All our warnings fell on deaf ears, wrote residents today. A catastrophe like this was inevitable.
We've been talking about this kind of thing happening. We've said amongst ourselves a few times, the worst that could happen would be a tragedy.
At the heart of their anger is fire advice given to people in the 120 flats here. In a neighbouring block, we film signs just like those at Grenfell Tower. They specifically tell residents to stay put in their flats in the event of a fire elsewhere in the building.
I think that's very ridiculous. I mean, if a building's on fire, even if all the flats catch fire and you're the only flat, say, in the middle of the block, there is no way you're going to be saved. There's no point in you staying put.
It's about 2:30 in the afternoon now. As you can see, there are still flames on the very upper level. Many blocks like this have a stay-put policy. In fact, it's been accepted and widespread advice for more than 50 years. But a big potential problem has today become a tragic reality. And this fire brigade union official backs furious residents, now demanding a review of the policy.
I think they have to look at that and say, is it the right model, given the way that this building's been refurbished, and is it the right advice we continue to give?
In November, a residents group posted this online. It is a truly terrifying thought, but the Grenfell Action Group firmly believe that only a catastrophic event will expose the ineptitude and incompetence of our landlord.
Many of the residents felt that their concerns were just being tossed aside and being treated as an overreaction because of all that had gone before, with all the problems during the refurbishment process, and it was just tenants and residents being a general nuisance yet again, finding something else to complain about.
Tonight, as many struggle to find words for this, safety investigators must begin to find answers. Residents say that now at last, and too late, they will be heard. Chris Choi, News at 10.
The construction company which oversaw the refurbishment for the council's Tenant Management Association insisted the work met fire regulation and health and safety standards. They subcontracted the cladding to a separate company. But in their response, both said they would cooperate with any inquiry into what caused the fire.
Ryden Group constructs and maintains buildings. In the past, the company's worked for local authorities all over London and the South East.
Ryden really is dedicated to improving the communities that we work in and making a real difference.
Ryden was paid just under £9 million to upgrade Grenfell Tower. The project appears on the company's website. In a statement, Ryden said the work it did met all required building control, fire regulation and health and safety standards. This morning, one of the company's directors took part in a phone interview on ITV and was repeatedly asked about the cladding that had been installed.
We don't know that there's any direct link between the fire and the cladding at this stage. I mean, we have to. I mean, I don't want to speculate on anything, and obviously we have to wait for the outcome of the inquiries. I know there's been a number of eyewitness reports and comments and so on and so forth, but at this stage, we can't. We don't know the start of the fire, the cause of the fire, whatever. And as far as we know, there's no link to the refurbishment works.
It later emerged that although Ryden was the contractor, the cladding work had been outsourced. Harley Facades Limited was paid just over £2.5 million to clad the exterior of the tower block and replace the windows. Details of the Grenfell project were on the company's website first thing this morning, but were later removed. Now, the office has been shut up early, and we were told that no one was available for interview. Tonight, Harley confirmed that although it fitted the aluminium cladding panels, it did not manufacture them. Both Harley and Ryden have pledged to help with any investigation. Kensington and Chelsea Tenant Management Organisation looks after Grenfell Tower and the council's other properties. A fire at a different tower block 2 years ago led to the London Fire Brigade taking enforcement action against the organisation. The Fire Brigade highlighted a failure to make a suitable and sufficient fire risk assessment, a failure to eliminate or reduce dangerous substances, and a failure to provide and or maintain adequate and clearly signed emergency routes and exits.
I do not run unsafe services. I'm absolutely shocked by this outcome. Well, what I say is actually people are saying lots of things and that doesn't mean they're true.
Ryden completed the Grenfell Tower refurbishment last June. The council inspected the site and signed the work off, suggesting it felt the contractors had delivered as promised. Joel Hills, News at 10, East Sussex.
Any inquiries into the fire will look beyond how it started to why it spread so quickly, and there could be a number of reasons. But after fires involving cladding in other countries, that is likely to be one key focus of the investigation.
How did the fire spread across Grenfell Tower so fast? That seems to be the central mystery to today's tragedy.
Astonishing that virtually the whole building is on fire very quickly, far more quickly than you would ever expect.
Architect Owen Luder said this should never have happened. This was a unique fire.
Fires have what they call a flash point. A fire starts in a small way. It takes 8 minutes for that fire to build up the heat in the adjoining material for suddenly to go off. And a fireman will tell you you've got to try and catch a fire within that 8 minutes, the flash point. The fireman got there within 6 minutes and it was already well ablaze.
The building's fire safety plan should have ensured that each apartment was compartmentalised, meaning that if there was a fire in one of them, it shouldn't have spread to the next. One lead in the investigation could be the cladding added to the building in a recent refurbishment and seen here falling off the side as it burns up. Composite cladding typically consists of an insulating foam sandwiched between two metal plates, either aluminium or steel. The foam is made of plastic, different kinds, some are more flammable than others. In a fire, joints and fixings can melt, causing the cladding to fall apart. The exposed foam can quickly ignite, and fire can shoot up the cavity between the building and the cladding. It can then spread through open windows, setting other stories alight. On some buildings, aluminium sheets are placed between the composite panels to stop fire spreading onto the building's exterior. Experts say that the UK's fire safety regulations are of a very high standard. So what was the failure at Grenfell Tower?
It could be that the materials used weren't the correct materials. It could be that there was some sort of breach to the compartmentation, meaning that there was heat travelling through the building in a way nobody would have expected, or it could be some unknown phenomenon, and that does happen sometimes.
The answers won't come quickly. The forensic investigation will go floor by floor to understand how this fire started and how to stop it happening again. Alok Jha, News at 10.
Well, some MPs have claimed that the fire would never have happened in the first place if lessons from a previous fire in London in 2009 had been heeded. And Labour's Jeremy Corbyn seemed to suggest that cuts to local authority budgets could have contributed to the fire here. This evening, in another announcement on the politics of safety, the Prime Minister promised a proper investigation and action if necessary.
The government response to the disaster was to order an immediate inspection of other tower blocks. But could action have been taken earlier, the Prime Minister was asked.
In due course, when the scene is secure, when it's possible to identify the cause of this fire, then of course there will be proper investigation, and if there are any lessons to be learnt, they will be, and action will be taken.
For Labour, one key question was whether council budget cuts were in any way to blame.
I believe we need to ask questions about what facilities and resources have been given to every local authority that has tower blocks within the area, and frankly, most do. We need to deal with this. We need people to be safe living in high-rise buildings.
8 years ago, 6 people died in a fire in this South London tower block. It had recently been refurbished. Afterwards, a coroner recommended a wide sweeping review of building regulations, which hadn't been looked at for 20 years. This MP, himself a former fireman who sits on a Commons Fire Safety Committee, says ministers, including Gavin Barwell, now the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, repeatedly refused to say whether that review was underway.
We've been asking government for the past 4 years, when will the review be undertaken, when will we see the new recommendations, and so far government hasn't supplied that to us. In 21st century Britain, 21st century London, people should not be dying in fires like this. We have got the technology to beat back fires through suppression systems, through fire sprinklers. We've got the intelligence to know how to construct buildings more safely.
In a statement, the government said it hadn't ignored calls for a review of building regulations. It said the work was ongoing. It also said letters had been sent out to local authorities encouraging them to fit sprinklers. But there are still likely to be many more awkward questions as to what ministers did and didn't do in the weeks ahead. Even one Conservative backbencher questioned his government's approach.
We've had debates, we've had meetings, and up until now, we've got nowhere we haven't been taken seriously. We must now be taken seriously.
There seems little doubt that after Grenfell, their concerns will be taken very seriously indeed. Libby Vina, News at 10, Westminster.
Many witnesses told us that people were being told to stay put in their flats, not risk leaving the building. Some undoubtedly owe their survival to not hearing this advice.
I just grabbed my children, my husband, and we just ran through the fire exit stairs. We saw women who jumped. We saw people put in bed sheets trying to get down, and police telling them not to. It's just everybody was panicking. It was chaotic.
He's sitting over there, that guy there, on the right-hand side. He's just spent 8 hours in that building. And the look in his eyes, phew, hell. The stories that I've heard today from the guys who have been in that building, there's a lot of people who have died. And from what I saw watching it through the entire night and trying to help out, obviously I couldn't do anything. Anybody that was in that building above the 14th floor, I don't think they got out.
You know what would have helped is if there had been a fire alarm. So when I was in the building, it was dead silent. So I was shocked that there was no fire alarm, no sprinklers. I think people would have got out if there had been an alarm.
There are then plenty of questions both for the council and the tenant management organisation that ran the block on their behalf, particularly since fire safety was raised by residents on many occasions.
My understanding is that their concerns were looked at and officers in the TMO or the council made inquiries and felt that we had done what was necessary.
The government has now ordered a check on the fire safety of all similar blocks. The official death toll is now 12. Nobody expects it to stay there.
Well, one of the first people on the site at 3:30 this morning was Dr. Shata Hadran. She's a doctor, and she joins me now, along with Pilgrim Tucker from the Grenfell Action Group that you were hearing about then. Pilgrim, we heard a little bit about Grenfell Action Group in the piece. It's been going now for, 7 years? So I know there's just, inevitably, we will have the noise of the emergency services coming through. But just tell us what its goal was when it first started, what you've been trying to do.
Its goal was, so I worked with the Grenfell Action Group and residents from Grenfell Tower over a period of many months, mainly during the summer of 2015. They wanted to get their voices and their concerns about the building heard. They were really worried about the potential fire hazards here. There were boilers being put in by the contractors. Blocking doorways was the proposal. So I worked with them to help them get organised.
Were the contractors asking residents for their input?
The contractors and the tenant management organisation said they'd done a consultation. The consultation was rubbish. They had designed a show flat and shown the tenants the show flats. When the work started happening in the flats, the actual residents' properties, it was nothing like it was in the show flat. The residents asked the TMO to listen to them. They wrote to senior managers in the TMO. The TMO didn't respond. I wrote to them on behalf of the organisation and the residents, and they didn't respond to us. Meanwhile, the residents knew the only time the residents started to get listened to was when they shut their doors, put signs on the doors, refusing the contractors access to their flats, and protested outside the housing management office. And they signed petitions.
We're going to hear, hopefully in the coming days, from the TMO, from the contractors. These are allegations, and obviously we will give them the right to respond to this. But your sense tonight, you have got members of your own group missing, is that right, in the building?
Yes, there's women who I've tried to call today and their phones are dead, and from what I understand they've not been identified or found yet.
A lot of people will have read today the piece that was written in 2016 predicting loss of life. Just explain to us what you meant by that piece.
Well, Ed, the guy who wrote that piece, was very aware, not professional, but it was obvious that the standard of works was really, really shoddy and really, really poor. Boilers in front of front doors, pipework sticking out inches outside of the walls. There were power surges that weren't looked into, where the lights in the building went dead, and the emergency lighting didn't come on. And these residents asked again and again and again, and they were threatened with legal action. When they said that they wanted this work to take place. You know, and you've got a cost-cutting council that isn't listening to its residents. It's a privatised organisation. And you've got a big building company, Ryden, that is getting a lot of money from a lot of contracts across London and doing shoddy work. And it's not just here, it's in other parts of London as well. It's very distressing. And like you said, this is a very unequal area. These are poor residents, or they're ordinary residents. They're not the wealthy, they're not the Camerons. They can't afford private schools, they can't afford lawyers. They tried to get lawyers, but because of the legal aid cuts, they couldn't get lawyers.
Welcome. We are going to be putting all those allegations and all the points you raise over the coming days to the parties at which you point the finger. So thank you very much for that.
Well, let's spend the rest of the programme thinking about the root causes and some of the misfortunes and mistakes that are made that might lead to these things. Fires will happen, obviously, and in tall buildings without sprinkler systems, the idea is they should be contained in a smallish portion of the structure. That is absolutely key. For residents, the advice is to stay put in their flats where they're behind fire-resistant doors, and then the fire brigade can get the contained fire out and remove the people within, say, an hour or so. That's the plan. In this case, the fire was not contained. It ripped through the building, which meant the generic advice to residents to stay put was not necessarily the right advice at all. So it all comes down to, why did the fire let rip? The building cladding is an issue here. It has been in other fires, and we've ascertained that a less fire retardant form of cladding was used in the renovation in this case. Chris Cook looks at some of the early evidence of what happened.
Oh my God, they're screaming!
How can we begin to understand the scale of the disaster that began in the early hours of this morning? What went wrong, and might it happen again? First, it's worth knowing that buildings like this are designed to contain fires. The idea is that if a fire breaks out, the fire brigade will have the time to combat it before it spreads. That's why the building had a so-called stay-put policy. People were supposed to stay in their flats until the fire was dealt with.
In this case, the tragic situation seems to be that the stay-put strategy that was in place, in fact, has led to people being in the building as smoke and flames penetrated right the way through the property. The normal strategy there is that, particularly with a tall building, then some people may be less able than others to be able to escape down staircases through, say, 24 stories of a building. And therefore, stay put is a recognized strategy where people may be less able, in a way, to rapidly escape down a staircase.
The issue is that the fire did not stay contained. It raced through the building. So that stay-put system broke down. And the critical question is why? The prime candidate for allowing the fire to spread is the so-called cladding, the insulation applied to the exterior of the building. This was added recently in 2015.
I think the attention on the cladding is because we've seen in the reports and the photographs burning exterior of the building, and we've seen enormous areas where the exterior is destroyed. Of course, the system that we've used, and we use widely in this country, and it's an accepted system, is an aluminium composite panel system. And that system effectively is it's a thin panel, so it's probably 6 millimeters thick or so. And typically, it's made of 2 sheets of aluminium with a core in between. And that core is critical as to what it's made of. Because if we look at some of the fires elsewhere around the world, and look at some of the fires in China or the Middle East, for example, that have been quite devastating, the core frequently has been a combustible type of plastic material.
Newsnight has learned that the specific cladding in use in Kensington was a product called Rhenobond. And in fact, there are 2 different versions of the cladding. The first is very fireproof. The second, which has a polyethylene core, is a bit less fireproof. And we've established it's the second, less fireproof version of the cladding that they used. There have been questions about polyethylene core cladding from abroad. For example, following fires like this one in Dubai. Watch this polyethylene fire from France in 2012. It starts small, then quickly jumps up floors via the outside of the building, and within minutes, it's racing up the exterior. But the contractors who fitted the cladding in Kensington insist that their materials and work met the required standards. All modern British cladding is supposed to be of limited combustibility. Whether our fire regulation is in the right place, though, has been an open question since a smaller disaster in London in 2009. 6 people died in the Lakanal House fire. Since then, though, not much has happened.
That led to a very, very detailed coroner's inquest and report. And part of that, they said that there should be a review of Part B of the regulations which govern high-rise buildings.
That's the fire regulations?
There's fire regulations, which hasn't yet been done. In October of this year, then Housing Minister Gavin Barwell said that it would be, but the sector's still waiting for that. And it was only in March this year, I think, members of the all-party parliamentary group on fire safety were warning that lives would be at risk if it wasn't.
The Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, which owns the building, has big questions to answer. The government's response to Lakanal House deserves probing too. We really need answers to make sure that other places don't suffer as Kensington has.
Chris Cook there. Well, Theresa May says lessons will be learned and actions taken, but there was that fatal fire in Camberwell in 2009, and some have drawn comparisons between that and this. Jeremy Corbyn made reference to it in his response today.
A review took place after the fire in Camberwell, and the government has that review. I believe we need to ask questions about what facilities and resources have been given to every local authority that has tower blocks within the area, and frankly, most do. We need to deal with this. We need people to be safe living in high-rise buildings.
Well, Sir David Amess is the Conservative MP for Southend West and chair of the All-Parliamentary Fire Safety and Rescue Group, which commissioned one of the reports that was into that earlier fire you heard Mr Corbyn talking about. And Matt Durack is the General Secretary of the Fire Brigades Union. Thank you both for coming in. Were lessons learned after the Camberwell fire?
Just want to say immediately there are no adequate words to express my sorrow for the families affected, and it's very frustrating that we're not being wise after the event. Our voice is now being heard once there's been a disaster. We have said over and over again, sprinklers stop lives being lost. And in 2013, the coroner, after the Lacanau disaster, recommended that sprinklers in these 4,000 old tower blocks could be fitted. And that's what we've been asking for all along. And we've also asked for a review of building regulations. We've been waiting 11 years.
Right. And what response have you had? Have you been stonewalled, or you've been told it's too expensive?
Well, it's all there in hindsight.
It's just, well, we want to do it, and yes, maybe we'll have another commission.
I mean, this fire shouldn't have happened, and I just do not understand.
So who are you blaming, David? Who? I mean, because that sounds like a central government policy decision.
In the anger and bitterness that everyone's feeling tonight, I'm not blaming anyone.
Right.
I'm just very frustrated that we're not wise after the event, that our all-party parliamentary group had pointed out to Parliament consistently that these things should be acted on. So, for instance, it's crazy that all new school buildings, as a matter of course, do not have sprinklers immediately fitted. You can't put a price on any person's life. That's the bottom line.
Right. Matt Durack, what have you taken out of this? The cladding issue? The sprinkler issue? I mean, where would you cut it?
Well, again, if I may firstly, just on behalf of firefighters across the UK, say how horrifying this incident is, and our thoughts are with the residents and particularly those who are bereaved tonight. It sounds like that is going to get worse. And also to pay tribute to the firefighters and emergency service workers who have undoubtedly saved lives. I mean, the starting point is that there needs to be an absolutely thorough investigation. The truth is, this should not be happening in the UK, one of the wealthiest countries in the world.
We've known how not to have it happen.
Indeed, and after Lacanau House, we provided support to the central government's fire and rescue advisor. We provided technical support from our own fire safety experts, and clearly, action hasn't been taken as a result of that incident. So, very serious questions have to be examined.
Did either of you know that polyethylene, which is a flammable or partly flammable material, was being used in cladding for buildings in current renovations or very recent renovations?
Well, I certainly
and was creating this chimney effect that means when you get a small fire, it just races up the entire...
Crazy.
Those pictures from France are crazy.
I woke up this morning to see that. I've attended fires in tower blocks before. I've never seen anything like that in the UK. And I think that's what will have shocked firefighters, to see the whole building engulfed as it was last night.
Matt, what about this stay put advice? Because that's always been the advice in a tall building, stay put. You've got a fire-resistant door. It wasn't the right advice on this occasion.
I think the advice, and even on the clip there, was if your own flat is not affected. The logic of construction of tower blocks is to compartmentalise the fire.
Indeed.
So a fire should be restricted to the flat or floor of origin. There should be smoke-resistant, smoke-safe doors on every floor, so that that residents can firstly get out if they need to. Secondly, that firefighters can enter the building, put water in the bottom, get water out at the top, and put out the fire in the flat. That's the whole logic. But if during the course of renovations, I'm not saying this has happened because we don't know, if during the course of renovations then fire-resistant walls, doors, ceilings, etc. have been compromised, then clearly the whole basis on which that advice is based falls apart. That's why the advice is there. In this incident, clearly it wasn't adequate for those people.
David, someone's heads have got to roll over this, haven't they? And who's it going to be? Because it sounds like it's people much higher up than fire chiefs or council chiefs. It sounds like it's policy decisions. You serve in Parliament.
Today is the wrong day
for those
and of course, every instant there's someone to blame. But I hope the new minister, Nick Hurd, will immediately tell all local authorities, all housing associations who have tower blocks in their stock to do an immediate review of their fire safety precautions. Forget Parliament convening, that's got to be done immediately. And I hope now that our all-party parliamentary groups advice will be acted on.
Matt, buildings renovated with polyethylene cladding, tall buildings, we can't deem them to be safe, can we, at this point? There are probably quite a few of them around.
There may well. We don't know the scale of that. We've had that's the problem about Lakenhall House. We had an incident where 6 people died, where again the building's fire protection had been compromised by alterations. Firefighters couldn't do their job in that situation. A coroner recommended action was taken. Action hasn't been taken, and people living in those blocks have the right now to ask that those questions are answered. The point is, and I'll finish, is this should not be happening. That's the horrible aspect to this event.
Thank you both very much indeed. Well, what does all this say about Britain today? A building with a population the size of a village completely destroyed. Now, of course, building regulations are not discriminatory. They're not more lax for the poor than the rich. But are they up to the job? Was renovation work done on the cheap? Were there budget constraints in housing departments? And was the management structure right? The building was run by a so-called TMO, a tenant management organisation. In this case, it was the Kensington and Chelsea one. And these are companies that look after council housing on contract. They were created with the purported aim of giving residents power over what happens on their estates. But the Grenfell Action Group, as we heard earlier, had been scathing about this TMO. And that all speaks to the way the country's run. Remember, too, that we live in an era of undocumented workers, casual housing arrangements, friends sleeping on floors and sofas because it's too expensive to find a place to live. That may add poignancy to the story of the dead and missing. Well, we can discuss all of this. I'm joined by Times writer David Aronovich, Sean Bailey, Conservative member of the London Assembly, and Anna Minton, an academic who writes about housing and public space. And a very good evening to you all. Anna, some have said this is a Hurricane Katrina-like moment.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. It's an iconic moment for British housing in a very similar way, I think, to Ronan Point in 1968, which collapsed, killing, I think, 4 people. And that signalled the end of mass system building and all the problems that had brought with it. It was the end of that era of tower block building. This is another symbolic moment, but actually this signals, I think, the end of a lack of accountability, because it's that lack of accountability that we've seen here, where residents' concerns, repeated warnings they've failed to, the tenants management organisation has failed to listen to them again and again. And just one key point to mention here, this isn't a tenants management organisation, it's what's called an ALMO. It's an arm's length management organisation, which is in fact a different sort of private company.
But it's a non-profit making company that is designed to help the residents and of council stock in Kensington.
It's an unaccountable quango.
But it has elected residents as majority of the board, doesn't it?
It manages the 10,000 social housing properties in the borough. It has, I believe, half of the board members are residents of the borough, so the rest of them are a mixture of council.
Residents of the borough or residents of the council housing?
I believe that they're residents from those 10,000 homes.
Right, yeah.
So we have a handful of residents from those 10,000 homes on that board. But it is quite clear, I mean, your report made it abundantly clear that that board has repeatedly failed to respond
we'll
to
let them answer that when they have
collected
themselves to do that. Sean Bailey, do you think this plays to an issue around power accountability? Is that the underlying story of this ghastly fire?
I think for me, the underlying story is firstly is the local people. I come from that area. My mum lives very close by. I've spoken to people there, and there's a lot of terror because close to Grenfell Tower is 2 other blocks of very similar vintage, and now there's people sat in those blocks. And
have they been renovated as well? Those
well,
other 2
I'm
blocks?
not sure, but
Right.
there's certainly people worried. I spoke to someone who lives in one of the blocks, and he is terrified. He said, "Well, if it happened to them, why couldn't it happen to us?" The key thing is, was it the regulations that went wrong, or was there some negligence around how the block is managed? They are 2 very different things, and that's what an investigation will need to look at. And for me, Almo, however a buildings run, we need to be able to see an audit of their fire risk assessments so that they can be held to account by an outside body. This is very important, because once we get past the pain of this so tragic incident, we're going to have to look at how do we prevent it again. And one of the key things is who manages and how they manage, and currently that hasn't been answered properly.
Right, I'm going to come to David, but Anna, there's a very specific problem that may well just account for a lot of this, which is a cladding problem. It's probably not what the tenants were complaining about. They probably didn't know that this cladding was polyethylene or whatever else. I mean, they may have been aware of that, but if it just turns out to be that, why would you then focus on accountability issues and power issues and all these things, as opposed to there's a problem with the building regs?
Well,
and
I mean,
they should have been better?
what I've heard is that the Tenants Management Organisation received 8 complaints of fire risk in recent years from that tower and other towers in the borough. So, you know, it's quite clear that there are much wider issues there.
Let me bring you in, David. I mean, what do you think about the argument that this speaks to a kind of dysfunctional relationship between the rich and the rest, and the many and the few, and all these issues we've been talking about?
This is, as David Amos said, 2017. And we should be so ashamed that this has happened in our capital city, a disaster of this scale. Now, what will happen, as happened with the big disasters in the 80s, the Marchioness, the Bradford fire, Hillsborough and so on, is that we will discover that the causes of this fire, like the causes there, were things that were pretty easily known about and could properly, with a fair bit of money and foresight and attention, been dealt with. Now, one of the big problems we've had a kind of assault on the idea of the cost and attention that is required from health and safety legislation and from health and safety practice. This is not, I mean, whether this is or not, this is a matter about poor people, rich people, is a matter we could come to. We could imagine that there are mansion blocks, old mansion blocks, which are equally unfitted with sprinklers and which equally might go up, but where actually complaints probably would be better heard. But we do not need to have disasters to be able to build preventative strategies into our mindset. We don't need it. We just need to spend the money and pay the attention.
Right. But that's why who's on the board is important. I've been on many tenant management organisations. I lived in similar blocks. And the problem is, if you put a lot of tenants on, it looks good, but what are you doing about the level of expertise? Because I wouldn't have known which type of cladding. I wouldn't have known if it's a risk or not. It may not have been, who knows? But you can't just build a board and do the cosmetic thing. You have to give people access to information that they can use to empower them.
You're right, of course. But we know that, for instance, external cladding was responsible for this fire at this large Dubai hotel, which everybody saw on YouTube and so on in on New Year's Day 2016. Now, if it is true that outside cladding can compromise every single major factor that is required for safety in our tower blocks, it is beyond comprehension why this would not be known and be acted upon.
But I mean, if the APPG's recommendations
the old party parliamentary
had been followed, and if there had been a review of regulations, and if we took regulation seriously, then that cladding would probably never have got through.
I mean, we're not very good at low probability events that are probably not going to happen to us. I mean, it's a sort of human failing, that sort of... I'm not going to worry about it, it's low on my list. But we do have people, as it happens in our country, who worry an awful lot about fire. We have fire briefings at the beginning of every meeting in a hotel. Someone will say these are where the exits
can
are.
I just say...
We've thought about this stuff. And so David's criticism is really interesting. How come we didn't know that, you know, cladding was a terrible risk and you needed sprinklers if you were going to have cladding.
Well, I mean, there's the cladding issue, which I think speaks directly to regulation, but this was not a low probability event. There were 8 repeated warnings. Thousands of tenants knew that this was going to happen. They wrote about it.
And the key thing here is the mixed information. Do you stay? Do you go? Somebody needs to be clear about that information, because that would have saved lives. We don't know if that was wrong or right, but we need a deep investigation by both the fire brigade and the police, because I know tonight there's tenants wondering, if this happened in my block, what would I do? And they're the questions that we need to answer.
All disasters are low probability events. The King's Cross fire had never happened before the King's Cross fire happened, but when it did happen, it was absolutely obvious that at some point or other it would, and if it did, it would happen with those kinds of consequences.
Don't think the big accountability issue of how you give people in positions of responsibility incentives to make sure they're thinking about these things and taking the requisite precautions and spending the right amounts of money. And how do we do that? Because it's very hard to say that's the bod who was, you know, who made the decision that was entirely responsible for it. Often it's just a non-decision rather than a decision, or it was a decision to think about it a little bit longer rather than a decision to do it straight away. What do we do? Do we want a culture which finds a culprit and says they're to blame and scares the wits off other administrators to make sure they don't get caught?
But I mean, when you have non-accountable quangos in charge who are not democratically elected, who are not going to be answerable, you're opening the door to this sort of thing.
Yeah, but I'm thinking about the people who set building regulations, who set budgets, who make decisions about, do we put sprinkler systems in tall buildings retrofitted, or do we leave
Accountability, you're right, Ivan. Accountability is only one issue, because of the point that Sean made, which is that the people who you might be accountable to don't necessarily know what the problems will be. So what you have to build in is a culture of prevention at almost all costs. That's the point. You have to spend the money, and not only that, but you have to stop complaining about the health and safety culture when you've got it. You have to prioritise it and say, yes, this is a very important thing, and yes, it might be slightly difficult for us, and yes, it may have us doing things that we don't quite like all the time, but actually it's a fairly essential part of seeing this kind of thing not happening.
It's about mitigating the risk. Obviously, you can't do 100% of mitigation, but there is definitely something glaringly wrong here. And although this might be a low probability event, fire is not. And we understand what starts fires and how we can fight fires. The London Fire Brigade has been very successful at reducing the level of fire. But this is a very particular thing that is scaring London. Again, there's many buildings of this vintage in London. Somebody needs to look at how we empower residents to look after themselves and the building, because that's the thing that will mainly save lives. If those residents were confident about the state of that building or what to do, a lot more people would have been alive tonight.
I mean, I don't think it's about empowering residents. It's about the fact that we've had a government that does not believe in regulation.
We need to leave it there. Thank you all very much on a very sad day.
I've been getting